So good afternoon once again. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. We'd like to begin this afternoon's lecture. So good afternoon. I'm Michael Liberatore, the chair of the theology department, and I'll be serving as the MC for the first part of this afternoon's lecture. We'll begin with a prayer. You may remain seated for the prayer. We'll ask everybody just to take a moment of silence to gather ourselves, to recognize the presence of the God of hope, the God in whom we find our hope, the God who is the ground of our hope. And for those for whom it's the sign of faith, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O God of quiet mornings, who paints the sky with mercy each dawn, teach me again how to believe in beginnings. You who planted stars in the dark, plant also in me a seed of courage, a root of light. When the root folds into a shadow and the silence feels heavy with doubt, be the whisper of my heart that says, keep going. Let me find you not only in miracles, but in ordinary things. A cup of cool water, a bird that does not worry, a breath I forgot to be grateful for. Lift my chin when I forget to look up, unfold my clenched hands, even if I walk with trembling steps, let them be toward the dawn. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So good afternoon once again, and welcome to everyone. We would like to acknowledge the presence of a few individuals. First, we welcome the Vice President for Mission Integration, Dr. Benji Tolosa, who's here with us this afternoon. We're also blessed with the presence of the Socius of the Society of Jesus, Father Peter Pohon, and Professor of Moral Theology at the School of Theology, Father Richie Hinido. And to begin this afternoon's lecture, we'd like to invite Dr. Patricia Lambino, Dean of the School of Humanities, to offer some welcoming remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to you all on the fourth installment of the Kwan Laurel Lecture in the Humanities. I want to recognize the presence of the rest of the faculty here. I see many faces from the Dean's Council, so thank you for being here, chairs of the School of Humanities, other faculty, especially from the Theology Department, and of course, our students. Let me introduce this lecture series. Established through a generous endowment from the Kwan Laurel family, this annual lecture series celebrates the relevance of the humanities in addressing the complexities of our world. Top international scholars are invited to explore and demonstrate the values of the humanities for understanding and engaging more deeply with the challenges of our world today. Now, as I said, this is the fourth installment. So what were the first three about? In 2022, the lecture featured David Crystal, an expert in English language studies. He was a master of original pronunciation at the Shakespeare's Globe, and his talk, What's New in Shakespeare Language Studies, debunked myths about Shakespeare's vocabulary and explored recent applications of linguistic research in theater. Okay, talk number 2 in 2023. This one featured Edith Hall, philosopher from the University of Durham. Her lecture, entitled Aristotle, Women, and Greek Tragedy, unpacked a paradox in Aristotle's accounts of women and examined the tensions between his remarks about male-female relationships in his ethical and political works in Greek and in Greek tragedy. The third one, we're getting to the end, 2024, actor and author Ben Crystal, in conversation with Dr. Beatrice Lay, who at the time was director of the Shakespeare Association of America, discussed the question, why Shakespeare now? And last year was the quadricentennial of the collected plays, the first folio. So they discussed how Shakespeare used his sources to create plays that spoke to his time, and how we today have put Shakespeare in different theatrical contexts, especially Asian contexts. Now, the fourth, 2025, I'm very happy to welcome Father Thomas Massaro, S.J., a theologian and ethicist. He is the Laurence McGinley Chair in Religion and Society at Fordham University. He brings theological and ethical perspectives to the fore, speaking on justice, hope, and expectations of the new papacy in the context of this Jubilee year. So across 4 years, we went from literature to languages, theater, philosophy, and now theology. The lectures have traced an intellectual arc, each one drawing from the classics and textual sources. They have helped and will continue to help us imagine and understand the human condition. In doing so, I hope the series affirms the humanities, not just as a field of study, but as a compass for living a more just and hopeful world. Thank you and welcome to all.
Thank you, Dr. Lambino. As we now move towards the lecture, we would like to introduce, magaling ako mag-English. We would like to introduce Dr. Stephanie Poon, Associate Professor in the Department of Theology, to introduce this afternoon's speaker.
So allow me the pleasure of introducing our speaker this afternoon, Thomas Massaro, S.J., who is the Laurence McGinley Endowed Chair in Religion and Society at Fordham University. He came to Fordham in 2018 as Professor of Moral Theology, a title he also held at Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Boston College, and at Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University, where he also served as dean. A Jesuit priest of the United States East Province, Father Massaro earned a doctorate in Christian social ethics from Emory University. His 11 books and over 150 published articles are devoted to Catholic social teaching and its recommendations for public policies oriented to social justice, peace, worker rights, and poverty alleviation. A former columnist for America Magazine, he writes and lectures frequently on such topics as the ethics of globalization, peacemaking, environmental concern, the role of conscience in religious participation in public life, and developing a spirituality of justice. Besides teaching courses on many aspects of Catholic social teaching and the role of religion in public life, Father Massaro also serves as Associate Director of Fordham's Center for Ethics Education. His most recent books include Mercy in Action, The Social Teachings of Pope Francis, and Pope Francis as Moral Leader. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Father Thomas Massaro.
Educators like me and educational institutions like this fine school for many decades, over a century now, they are in what I call the hope business. We would not be investing time and resources in the education of the rising generation of citizens if we did not hold the conviction that the world they inhabit would in the future be a hospitable place, and perhaps even better than the present state of society. The business of hope compels us to go out on a limb to make such bold claims and wagers that progress is possible. But being people shaped by hope does not mean that we blithely shut our eyes to all contrary evidence, that we choose simply to ignore the weighty problems that we face every day. The most valuable kind of hope is the variety of hope that is acutely perceptive about reality, warts and all, and yet dares nevertheless to project a better future. Recall the familiar distinction between hope and optimism. Optimism is simply a belief that good things will happen, that the odds for favorable outcomes happen to be on your side. So it remains somewhat passive in nature. It's non-committal. Hope, on the other hand, involves human agency and the deliberate choices that we make and enact in order to face up to adversity. Hope runs much deeper than just experiencing a good vibe. Rather, authentic hope is a proactive attitude that we take towards desirable and high-stakes outcome, aspirations that we regard as difficult but at least possible to attain. This sense of possibility motivates and encourages us to act boldly, to bring about the outcomes we yearn to accomplish. Hopers, then, are people deeply committed to enacting the desired future through effective action. This realization raises challenging questions for each of us. Are we willing to make the commitments and engage in strenuous efforts to promote alternatives to the current sorry state of the world? Have we acquired the habit of daring to project our vision for a better world, to shape a future of justice for all people? Hope is an insistence that all will yet be well, and a person of hope is one who refuses to give in to fatalism or despair. Besides the educational sector, the church is also in the hope business. Part of its mandate to pursue the threefold theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, dating back to St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Even in the first decade after the earthly life of Jesus, Christians recognized that hope is one of the most valuable of attributes and character traits, something that endures in all ages. Now, other religions, for their part, also affirm the value of hope, expressing this priority in their own distinctive ways. For example, in the Quran, the scriptures sacred to the Islamic community, we read this verse: "For indeed with hardship there will be ease." That's in Surah 94, verse 5. Thus affirming the same confident expectation of relief from adversity and eventual deliverance from sufferings, even salvation from this distressing ways of the world, as we find in the Christian faith as well. I am overjoyed to be visiting this beautiful country for the first time, and I was especially delighted to receive this invitation to speak at this prestigious Jesuit university on the topic of hope. It's no coincidence that we're still in, yes, the Jubilee year of hope proclaimed by our much beloved late Pope Francis, and I'll be treating his successor, Pope Leo XIV, in the second half of this address. The Roman Catholic Church has been celebrating such holy years for over 700 years now, a wonderful tradition of special prayers, devotions, and pilgrimages, like walking through those special doors of certain cathedrals, emblematic of the long memory that persists in our church. As a community of hope spread throughout the globe, Catholics have endured disheartening wars and plagues and natural disasters of all sorts. But our leaders have continued unabashedly to preach a message filled with hope, hope of eventual salvation of the spiritual variety, of course, but also hope of temporal improvement and of the fulfillment of social justice and a better life in the here and now. At its best, the Catholic faith involves not some escapist flight of fantasy exclusively regarding otherworldly spirituality, but rather an activist community of people engaged in secular affairs and social concerns, participating in the struggle for social justice wherever that commitment may lead. We mobilize time and again to promote our hopes. I am, of course, eager to keep this presentation solidly grounded in reality. That is, to avoid making too many airy generalizations about hope, and also to avoid focusing exclusively on developments within the church circles. There is a big old world out there, populated, of course, by a good many people who would claim that a pessimistic worldview would be more realistic and would reflect human historical experience more accurately than the hope-filled sermons we might prefer to hear. Some voices you hear in the media and on the streets portray today's world as a veritable hellscape, a dystopia where we are doomed to struggle in vain for even a sliver of good news. I consider that an unfortunate exaggeration, although I would be the first to admit that human history is hardly a tale of unmitigated triumphs, but rather it's a series of cautionary tales beset by setbacks and adversity. So, to keep our feet solidly on the ground, let's take a hard look at a sampling of current developments in the wider world where the dynamics of hope are on full display. We'll be looking at some discouraging trends and data for the next few minutes, but remember that hope never shrinks from an honest recognition of obstacles, especially those that prevent challenges in the short term. Genuine hope does not ignore pain, suffering, and the brokenness of the world. Allow me to offer 3 case studies, 3 contemporary social concerns that challenge our hopeful stance but should never overwhelm it. The 3 are the natural environment, the global debt crisis, and corruption in civil government. First, the state of the environment. Even in the span of our lifetimes, the stakes of environmental degradation have risen dramatically. Since the dawn of the industrial age, human societies have experienced the ill effects of toxins and water and air pollution. I so admire the pioneering work of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines in publishing their 1988 document, What is Happening to Our Beautiful Land? It's an instructive text that I have shared with my American students for many decades now, and one which paved the way for the raising of environmental awareness in church circles and beyond throughout the world. Pope Francis cited this visionary Filipino document in Chapter 1 of his landmark ecological encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home, in which he lamented this quote, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth." In even more recent decades, scientists have drawn our attention beyond toxic trash heaps, compiling persuasive evidence that the more insidious problem of global warming and climate change is threatening the habitability of our entire ecosystem. They measure rising sea levels, melting polar caps, and a sharp spike in greenhouse emissions, all caused by destructive human activity. We now witness life-threatening desertification and drought due to our misuse of creation, especially our insistence on burning fossil fuels like coal and oil that pump huge, unsustainable amounts of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. And there's an obvious social justice dimension woven in here, involving glaring disparities between the global north and the global south. The structural inequity here is quite shocking. While the advanced industrial economies of a minority of nations on Earth, my own native land, the USA, is included here, have generated a disproportionate share of carbon emissions, it's the more numerous nations and populations of the global south that have suffered the worst effect of rising seas and catastrophic storm events. Being situated in the tropics and often at low-lying altitudes, many island nations in particular are absorbing immense damage caused by forces unleashed through no fault of their own. You know well the recent history of increasingly frequent and intense typhoons striking the 7,000 islands that you call home, not to mention other more precarious Pacific island nations which could be completely submerged by rising seas and superstorms in the coming years. Global climate change has already been harming the least resourced and most vulnerable nations on Earth, and current projections bode even worse. As much as global South nations seek to contribute to solutions, they rarely possess the requisite resources to move the needle. Compared to the affluent major industrial powers with the most carbon-intensive economies, poorer countries find it nearly impossible to finance clean energy projects and abatement measures. The aspirations of these nations to meet the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, adapted by the United Nations, are often shattered by an inability to shift resources from pressing needs. So these nations are less likely to hit many of the quantifiable targets by the year 2030 as specified. By now, this basic narrative is familiar, and if you're at all like me, you find it sharply discouraging. A real existential threat to our planet in the long run, and of course, a threat to a stance of hope even in the short run. In the face of these daunting prospects, where may we look for signs of hope? Actually, as it turns out, there are many places that inspire hope regarding the environment. For example, next month, representatives of almost every nation on Earth will gather in Brazil for COP30. This so-called Conference of Parties, COP, has been spearheading global efforts to mitigate climate change for 3 decades now, and the process has repeatedly secured substantial anti-pollution commitments, especially to wean our economies off fossil fuels and to develop renewable carbon-neutral energy. The superpower on display here is, of course, collective action and cooperation on a global scale. So just yesterday, I learned the wonderful Filipino term bayanihan, a rallying cry for community spirit, right? That captures this notion better than any phrase that I've ever learned in English. We have common good, community spirit, but you have bayanihan. I'm going to go with that. Prominent environmental activist Bill McKibben has repeatedly praised global efforts to pool our micro efforts to effect macro changes in the economy to achieve crucial goals that transcend any one place or region, such as the reduction of our collective carbon footprints. Indeed, scientists were encouraged by data collected during the pandemic, during the so-called COVID pause. With decreased industrial and travel activity, we witnessed considerable ecological progress as fewer hydrocarbons like oil and coal were burned, and the environment had a rare chance to reset itself. Air pollution levels declined markedly, and vegetation and wildlife returned to many urban settings. It turns out that many habitats are surprisingly resilient. Maybe not infinitely so, but projections provide encouragement that if we could find the political will to stop the abuse of nature, the environment would rebound in significant ways. So, if you're looking for a basis of hope regarding the environment, pair those encouraging signs in the secular and scientific domains with the religious leadership already mentioned. For every Greta Thunberg, remember that famous Swedish teenage eco-activist, there is a Pope Francis or a Patriarch Bartholomew of the Orthodox Church issuing powerful calls to action. Together, these secular and religious leaders have the ability to raise our collective consciousness and of the urgent needs of our beloved Earth and to motivate us to take effective action. A second and related matter of urgency is the global debt crisis. My treatment of both the problem and the bases for hope can be a bit briefer here, since the broad lines of the analysis are probably quite familiar to most of you, and because they parallel what we just saw regarding the environment. Once again, there's a shocking differential between the situations faced by the global North and the global South. When low-income nations take on massive external debts, usually due to borrowing from such financial organizations as the International Monetary Fund and from commercial banks charging high rates of interest, the compounded debt soon becomes crushing and unsustainable. The world witnessed an especially dramatic spiral of debt in the final decades of the past century, when corruption and sharply skewed borrowing practices trapped dozens of heavily indebted poor countries, or HIPCs, into mountains of odious debt. Servicing the debts by paying back what little they could led these struggling debtor nations into great hardship as they cut educational, social, and vital healthcare services to their most vulnerable citizens, simply to pay back a fraction of the accrued interest on that debt. In the 1990s, the massive human suffering caught the eye of sacred, secular and religious leaders alike, who formed a coalition to apply the financial powers in the private and the government sectors alike. You may recall that famous photo of Pope John Paul II and Bono, the lead singer of the Irish rock band U2, I love him, appearing together and speaking out forcibly in unison to urge the cancellation of much of the crushing debt. Besides the photo ops, it required many behind-the-scenes maneuverings in banks and international organizations to translate the expressions of social concern and goodwill into concrete measures that leveraged donated or loaned pools of capital into substantial relief for the poorest nations at that time. The nonprofit organization Jubilee USA documents hundreds of billions of dollars in debt relief that have certainly saved millions of lives, starting with survivors of the HIV/AIDS epidemic who benefited from programs funded by debt relief measures. St. John Paul II made this initiative a centerpiece of his efforts to usher in the new millennium with a sense of joy. Recall that the year 2000 was also a Jubilee year of the Catholic Church, like this year, an occasion when millions of Christians around the world were reminded of the biblical mandate of Christians to periodically release the captives, cancel debts, and restore the land. It's all contained in chapter 25 of the Old Testament book of Leviticus. Look it up. The very word Jubilee derives from that practice of emancipation in the time of ancient Israel. And of course, we need to update the details of debt forgiveness to match the economic arrangements of our time. But Jubilee retains its meaning as good news, a cause of celebration especially for the poor and oppressed of this earth. It's no accident that Jesus inaugurated his public ministry with a proclamation, it's in Luke chapter 4, that he had come to bring such acts of liberation. And of course, the Lord's Prayer includes an entreaty to forgive us our debts on whatever scale, as we forgive the debts of others. Setting people free from debt is at the very heart of Christian faith. Whether we're referring to landless enslaved workers of ancient Israel or the HIPCs of the year 2000 or now 2025, when parallel situations have returned to dire proportions, we need to take to heart these moral imperatives to restore people to wholeness. How does the virtue of hope come into play here? The answer should be obvious. In every era of human history, power becomes sharply concentrated into too few hands, and the great majority suffer. History seems to repeat itself, and not in an encouraging way either. But the persistence of injustice does not doom us to despair and a fatalistic stance. With great leaders of the religious, political, and economic variety, and ample support from ordinary people willing to stick out their necks and support and effect social change and the reform of our institutions, a better future is possible. Substantial debt relief was indeed achieved a generation ago, and now it is time for our generation to expose the problems, to publicize the abuses, to propose solutions, and to enact measures to correct what has gone wrong. I'm so proud of our late Pope Francis for his advocacy, especially in the final years of his life, to revisit the issue of debt relief and refocus the world's attention to this great crime against humanity, a crime that repeatedly victimizes the most vulnerable. As a native of Argentina, a southern nation which struggled under a high debt burden for most of his life, Francis appreciated the urgency of change. Wherever we find ourselves these days, can we rouse our collective conscience once again? The problem of external debt on a global scale will persist long after the current Jubilee year ends in January. But will our energy flag, or will it be renewed and extended? Hope places its wager with an affirmative answer to that pressing question. My third and final example is the interplay of hope and government corruption. Both my country and yours have been grappling for a long time now with especially challenging malfeasance and the erosion of accountability and democratic norms among our political leaders and institutions. I will resist the temptation to provide many details here, since you all know the plight of your country better than I ever will. And I have to say, treating the complex abuses that are on display in the United States government these days would derail this presentation. It would also spike my blood pressure to dangerous levels. My doctor has been concerned about my blood pressure lately. Suffice it to say that when any government strays from the path of legal propriety, away from the principle of consent of the governed, and respect for the limits of its constitutionally defined power, the entire people suffer, and the most vulnerable suffer most of all. Both our countries have experienced unjustified, excessive uses of force, whether rationalized by enforcing drug laws or immigration regulations or reining in gang-related activity. Sometimes the abuses of power are blatantly violent, as in drug enforcement raids, migrant roundups, extrajudicial killings. Sometimes it involves more subtle modes of usurping and projecting power, such as intimidating reporters, media outlets, civil society institutions, legislatures, and the court system. We've witnessed with distress all of these abuses and further departures from the rule of law in countries around the world, countries that were previously considered solidly democratic. The slide towards sinister authoritarianism and oligarchy is real, and it's deeply disturbing. My fervor note to you is this: we have to stand resolute in the conviction that any government that tramples on the civil rights of its citizens invites firm resistance. I would even invoke the term civil disobedience, as long as that campaign to expose injustice is nonviolent, in the fine tradition of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and I think we can all add your national hero, Jose Rizal, to this honorable list of nonviolent people. If you participated in the September 21st protests, the Trillion Peso March, featuring that brave Bishop Colin Bagaforo on the streets of Manila against the embezzlement and misappropriation of funds intended for flood prevention and relief, then you already appreciate this point. If you did not confront the wrongdoers and express moral outrage at vast corruption and make our voices heard, then we miss an opportunity to stand up for justice. In the fine Catholic tradition of constructive engagement in civic affairs, people of faith participate in such protests in support of moral and spiritual values, beyond any superficial partisan points that may be at stake. So, where do we find hope when governments stray from principles of justice and fairness? Are there constructive and healing places we can go with our distress, with our laments? There certainly are. Hey, you might start by looking in the mirror. If you have participated in activities such as protests to resist oppression of any sort, you have already taken a risk to support a hoped-for outcome of reform and justice. In a democracy, peaceful protest is not just appropriate, it's a requirement of responsible citizenship when confronted with a situation of widespread corruption. If you have not stuck out your neck quite yet, then realize that you can, in an instant of bravery, become part of the solution, not satisfied to be part of a habitually apathetic people. If you do go out on a limb with acts of courage, you will be in such good company, along with millions of citizens of Nepal and Indonesia, 2 countries in this region of the globe. You will be joining contemporary movements to hold governments accountable to standards of decency and principle. In my corner of the globe, we have held regular demonstrations. The July 14th No Kings rally, I joined that, and there's another coming up on October 18th. So they took place in every major American city to insist on a return to our long-held democratic values. And for Filipinos, while it is satisfying to look back at the People Power Revolution of 1986, it's even more important to look ahead to actions and strategies to forge an even better future. A stance of hope rejects the inevitability of corrupt governments. Sure, most of the humans who ever lived on Earth have suffered the weight of abuses by their kings or emperors or magistrates, but it need not be the way on a permanent basis. From what I know of your national history, peaceful resistance to tyranny has succeeded here in dramatic fashion in the past, even in the lifetime of many of us present in this room. Under the leadership of such bold religious leaders as Jaime Cardinal Sin, but of course, primarily secular leaders in civil society, you have insisted that governmental power play its proper role as a servant of the people, as agents of the common good, never as an instrument of personal aggrandizement and narrow interests. If hope involves acts of resistance, then the episodes recorded in your history books witness to plenty of hope. So that concludes my coverage of the 3 case studies in the dynamics of hope in the face of adversity. Other examples could be explored: the refugee crisis, the crisis of spiraling economic inequality, threats to peace in Gaza, Ukraine, many parts of Africa, among others. Each is the cause of great human suffering, and the cumulative weight of all these deeply concerning situations may give us the impression that the world is lurching from crisis to simultaneous crisis. But my ardent hope is that you will join me in recognizing that however dark human affairs may appear right now, there are tangible signs of hope amidst each challenging situation. As ever, hope remains maddeningly elusive, impossible to quantify in inventory. I wish I possessed an accurate hope-o-meter, right, that I could point to in order to gauge the level of hope appropriate in each of these case studies. We see the rays of sunlight here filtering through the dark clouds, even if we have to trust in the strength of that light to ultimately dispel the darkness. Okay, so I didn't leave much time to cover Pope Leo XIV, but perhaps that's for the better. So far, we have only sketchy evidence of what his priorities will be as Pope. He's still finding his voice. Examining his sermons and mostly brief public addresses since his election back in May, we need to read between the lines quite a bit to distill any unified message, as he tends to be more guarded than Pope Francis and more precise with his words. We will know much more when his first programmatic teaching document, probably an apostolic exhortation, not an encyclical, is published this Thursday, October 9th, after he spent the entire summer at Castel Gandolfo, his retreat, working on the text. The Vatican watchers among my friends report that they expect Pope Leo to exhibit a solid continuity with the synodal path and social justice priorities championed by Pope Francis. And I take this to be very good news. Rumor has it that the document will be called Dilexi Te, translated, I have loved you, and that the first draft was actually started by Pope Francis in his final weeks on earth. I can't wait to see it. Thursday. On the topics covered today, we can be cheered that Leo will likely be yet another green pope, leveraging his moral authority to call the world to environmental responsibility and sustainability. Two recent papal addresses marking the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si confirm that hope. Pope Leo's evident love of the most vulnerable of God's children and his closeness to the humble, especially in his decades of service in a modest corner of Peru, bodes well for the continuation of a papal commitment to social justice as an advocate for structural change to reform our economy. In an early interview, the new pope volunteered that his choice of papal name was inspired by Pope Leo XIII, who over a century ago published the encyclical Rerum Novarum, a manifesto of the Church's support for hard-pressed workers and defense of their economic rights, including to form labor unions in the struggle for a living wage. Hopefully, our current Leo will reveal a similar commitment to political justice and civil rights with an insistence on good governance rather than tolerating corrupt regimes. But it would be hard to read the tea leaves of this enigmatic new papacy any further than these general observations. Stay tuned. In short, Pope Leo represents the hope that we need now more than ever. Isn't it remarkable that after waiting millennia for a top church leader to emerge from the global south, the Catholic Church has now elected 2 consecutive popes, either from or with long experience in the Southern Hemisphere, an Argentinian Jesuit, and then an Augustinian bishop dedicated to his adopted diocese in Peru. Hey, why not next a Filipino pope, right, from around this area? Leadership from the most populous continent of all, especially from here in East Asia, is long overdue. And actually, I want to say I'm rooting for you guys to produce a pope. As an American and a Jesuit, I got my wish the last 2 popes. We have a Jesuit, we have an American. Maybe it's your turn. But I don't want to leave the impression that all will be well if we just continue to have good popes or other church leaders who are committed to social justice and who promote the structural change we so badly need. We all have a part to play to keep hope alive, and a broad-based participatory coalition is always the key to social progress. Indeed, if theology teaches us anything, it is that God's preferred way of dealing with us humans is to weave the threads of divine providence through human agents, and sometimes through very surprising heroes at that. I leave you with 3 closing thoughts, so 3 final paragraphs. First, you may have noticed that the first word of the title of this presentation is the word visioning. Okay. I certainly don't want to neglect that powerful word, a word that I greatly admire. I've learned much from the growing field of sports psychology, which teaches us that athletes are unlikely to succeed unless they first visualize the end result, whether that's a basketball going through the hoop or a runner crossing the finish line in record time. Hey, it's the same with the life of faith. The common sense observation that we benefit from imagining what success will look like in the end. Conjure up in your mind's eye the picture of success and then pursue that positive outcome with all your might. Actualizing a well-defined potential is essential for realizing our hopes. And by the way, that bit of sports psychology wisdom may have made the decisive difference in the Blue Eagles' stunning victory Sunday night over De La Salle. I was there at the MOA arena. I was rooting against De La Salle. Why would you name your team the Green Archers? What does it mean? What does it even mean? That's my point about sports psychology. Here's my second to last point. We theologians continually grapple with one of the oldest questions faced by people of faith. Where is God when people suffer? Where can we find God when the headlines seem so bleak? We call this the theodicy question, our ardent attempts to explain the mysterious ways of a compassionate God in a world that repeatedly disappoints us. I cannot even begin to provide a comprehensive answer to that bundle of questions here, but I do want to point you to the parables of Jesus, specifically the parables of the kingdom of God, where you will find ample resources to feed your own life of hope. These stories tease us with the consoling hints that God is not only not absent when things go wrong, but that our loving Creator is already present in profound ways, even in the very midst of our doubts and our distress. When you realize that God sent his own Son to identify with our human condition, indeed to undergo worse sufferings than most of us will ever endure, that is a cause of hope if there ever was one. Check out the parable of the mustard seed, the pearl of great price, the leaven in the dough, the sower and the seeds, the dragnet in the lake, among others in Matthew chapter 13 and elsewhere in all 4 of the Gospels, and see if you do not agree about the bases of our hope in the mysterious presence of God already in our midst. Hope is not destroyed by adversity. As St. Paul wrote into the Corinthians, we are afflicted but not crushed. We are perplexed but not driven to despair, persecuted but never abandoned, struck down but not destroyed, beaten down but not defeated. In other words, hope endures as one of the most powerful forces of the universe. Sure, we must live with temporary doubts and setbacks, but we trust in eventual transitions to success and ultimate victory. Final point. Hope is sustained by narratives, by the stories we repeat to ourselves to recall the bases of our hope, even amidst adversity. The greatest such story is, of course, the account of the Passion of Jesus Christ, who triumphed over sin and death on the cross, only to conquer death itself in the mystery of the resurrection on Easter Sunday. This narrative is preserved in the Gospels that have, for 2,000 years now, shaped Christians to be people of hope. Besides that central narrative that grounds all of our hopes, we have many other stories that provide encouragement in our day-to-day struggles. The life story of a favorite saint, the heroic deeds of a national hero, the persistence of a selfless scientist or artist or loving parent. All of these stories of hope have the power to spark expectations of an improved future whenever we recall the narratives. In this fractured world that we inhabit, we need all the encouragement we can muster in order to be, and here's a quote, always ready to give a reason for our hope to all who might ask. That sentence is a paraphrase of a key verse of the New Testament about hope. It's 1 Peter 3:15. Hope is the thread that binds together all our efforts for social justice. This was precisely what Pope Francis had in mind when he chose the title of his document launching the current Jubilee Year of Hope. The Latin is Spes non confundit, and in English, hope does not disappoint. I sincerely wish that hope will never disappoint you as well, and that you will stay in the hope business and continue to be a pilgrim of hope throughout your life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Massaro, for your forward-looking, but most of all, hopeful remarks. So as an expression of our profuse thanks to Father Massaro, we once again give him a one big hand. At this juncture, we open the floor for some conversations. We would like to invite the audience to engage Father Massaro's lecture, whether by asking a question or offering a comment. We got 2 microphone stations at both aisles. If you can please begin by introducing yourself before jumping in. There.
Hello, Father. I'm I'm David Castro from BSITE first year, and I have a question that I wanted to ask. Like, it's a bit of a burning question in my mind because personally I don't follow the workings of the church that much, but I was watching it live when they were electing the new pope, and I've always wanted to ask why did why didn't why didn't pro prefect Luis Antonio Tegel become the pope?
Oh, yeah, Archbishop Cardinal Tagle, Luis Antonio Tagle
Okay, yeah,
has
I-
been well known. So I've never been to the Philippines before, and I knew a lot about him. His reputation is so good around the world. Pope Francis elevated him. I know that you feel bad. They took him away from the Philippines, from Manila here, but elevated him to the leadership of the most important Vatican office. At least Pope Francis elevated the dicastery for evangelization as the very top, the first one listed of all the Vatican offices. So, David, I wouldn't want to interpret the fact that somebody else was elected. I wouldn't interpret that as a rejection or a diminishment of Cardinal Tagle in any way. I suspect there were 133 cardinals entering the conclave, right? They were locked inside the Sistine Chapel for all the time until they had four rounds of balloting, I think. So no, anybody who didn't get elected pope, that is not a dishonor. There were some high profile cardinals that could have been elected, but they could only, in the end, choose one man. I would love to know, but we will never know how many votes Cardinal Tagle got on the first vote. I would love to know that. It's a little political interest of mine. But the cardinals, do you know this? The cardinals are sworn to secrecy. In fact, if a cardinal reveals how he voted or what the vote total was in first round, second round, third round, he could be excommunicated. It's a harsh punishment. So again, David, don't feel bad. I knew that he was a strong contender. For all we know, he came in second, and there's no dishonor in that. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Okay.
Hi, my name is Roxy Florendo from ABIS. And before I ask my question, I just want to say that I really did enjoy this talk, especially in that right now it's really a time of negativity and despair for lots of people. And I think this talk was really insightful.
Thank you, Rex.
Okay, so for my question, I wanted to ask, what role do you hope that Pope Leo holds in the persistence of global issues around the world? And I wanted to ask, how will that be similar or different to the role that Pope Francis held?
Extremely well phrased question. Thank you. And I've written 2 books about Pope Francis, and I always start any chapter or article about Pope Francis by saying every pope, that includes Francis, that includes Leo now, inherits from the previous popes. Do you know this word, a playbook? So in American sports, if you're a baseball player, a football player, maybe basketball, you're given a binder of it's called a playbook. So when the coach yells out, number 4, we're going to play number 4, you're supposed to do this or do that. So a playbook in papal terms, not sport, you can tell I love sports, right? But in papal terms, not sports terms, a playbook is an accustomed way of operating. Here's a great example. Peace. Every pope, at least for the last 150 years, I think that's safe to say, every pope from the 1880s until what were we, the 2020s, has been an advocate for the peaceful resolution of conflict. Okay. Before that, popes got involved in the Crusades. That was not a good episode, by the way. And when the popes had the papal estates and the Holy Roman Empire, popes were not rooting for peace. They were rooting for the victory of the Roman armies. So We turned a page in the 19th century. So when Pope Francis came into office, he inherited the playbook of, and maybe you know some of the previous popes. Pope Paul VI was an advocate for peace. Pope John the 23rd, who started the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, wrote an entire encyclical, long letter, Pacem in Terris, peace on earth. So one answer to your question is the continuity from pope to pope. I only picked one topic, peace, but environment. So isn't it funny that Pope Benedict, he reigned from 2005 to 2013. He was called the Green Pope, right? Because he wrote 4 paragraphs in an encyclical. It was called Caritas and Veritate, just 4 paragraphs on ecology. And they said, oh, it's the Green Pope. And he also installed photovoltaic solar cells on the roof of some Vatican buildings. That and carbon offsets in Eastern Europe. That enough was earning him the Green Pope name. Then Pope Francis comes in. He didn't write 4 paragraphs. He wrote 6 chapters, an entire encyclical, Laudato Si, one of the longest encyclicals, 80,000 words about green. So I kept calling him the Greener Pope. And now Leo, just in the last 2 weeks, he convened a conference in Rome on the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si. It was released October 3rd, 2015. So it was just last week. It was the 10th anniversary. He could be the greenest pope. I don't know. We just keep going. So the answer to your question, Roxy, is popes have continuity with their previous popes. My hope for Leo is that he continues that checklist of things: environmental activism, peace activism, economic justice, concern for refugees. That's a really big issue. And that, of course, not just to repeat Francis. We don't need a carbon copy of Francis. We need a new version. So take Francis's work, update it, apply it to new places. There'll be new crises, and he'll be ready to do that. So what a well-phrased question, Roxy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Okay, hi, I'm Aya Takador from 1BS Bio. And you mentioned, actually, I would like to give a few remarks lang. I really actually thoroughly enjoyed your talk, especially about hope, of course. And this actually reminded me of one of my readings in theology, and it's called While I Breathe, I Hope. So you mentioned theodicy, which is the justification of belief in an all-good God in suffering. So as someone who's previously had this mentality, how should you suggest we reframe this idea when facing adversity like corruption or death or natural environment with regards
Yes.
to how we can hope in relation to God?
Yes, yes. And there's no easy answer. As I said in my second to last paragraph about theodicy, the question of why does a compassionate God allow good people to suffer? There was a rabbi in the United States, Rabbi Kushner, who wrote a book called Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? And it was a brilliant book. And at the end of the book, he said, I don't know. 200 pages later, I bought that book. I paid a lot of money for that book. I don't know either, but think about all we can do is to put the pieces together in a way that makes sense to us. Again, we're not going to reach a completely, what do you call it, thought out, rational conclusion. It's not a puzzle to be solved. It's more about bringing together the bad experiences of mourning, sadness, suffering for yourself or other people, and then the positive messages that if you, especially anybody who's Christian, and I had that quote from the Quran, even the Islamic world, recognizes that suffering isn't the final word, that even though in the short term there is suffering and death and diseases and injustice, and it makes me depressed, but we could make that long litany of bad things. But if you put faith, it's an affirmation of hope, then you're looking at the further horizon. Oh, it's like in the middle of the night. When will the sun come up? It's time for dawn. It does come. It's come every day for the last 4 billion years. We just have to be patient. I could give you a list of the sad things that have happened in my life. 6 years ago, my father died. That's the worst thing that's ever happened in my life. And it took me a long time to engage that. I think I was mad. I was angry at God. How could you take away my dad? But then over time, you all have had suffering in your family. Maybe you've lost a grandparent. Over time, again, it doesn't take away the pain, but it puts pain in a context. And by the way, my father was suffering very badly from congestive heart failure. So I had been with him in the hospital. I'd seen him through surgeries. It was painful. And it was almost merciful that at age 86, that was the end of his life. So I guess I'm trying to put the most positive note on it by giving you some examples. It doesn't take away the pain. If you ever think that there's some magical words that a priest or a professor is going to say to you that will just take away your pain, no, we're not in that business. We're not in the business of puzzles. We don't solve puzzles. We engage the suffering and hope that we can inspire a long-term view. So good. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I understand that we all want to engage Father Tom, but in the interest of time, probably we can limit the questions or comments to 4 more. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll give shorter answers. Is that possible? No, it's not possible.
Go ahead.
Good evening, Father. I am Aaron Tan, also a first-year BS biology student.
Good.
I really appreciate your mention of the nature biodiversity crisis in this talk, and I especially like your approach to seeing this crisis in a hopeful way. I feel like it's a very good framework to use, especially since a huge problem in specifically biodiversity issues nowadays is apathy. People don't really get to understand, get to empathize with the issues that are happening in the environment. I think action-driven hope, as you've mentioned, is a good remedy to that. Although my succeeding question, though, will veer from that. See, I have a few relatives from China. Actually, I have a Chinese heritage, and a sentiment that has been expressed to me a lot, especially by my grandmother, is that she has this fear of being ostracized, seeing as China as a country has had several social injustices inflicted upon them. And I don't know, it just feels as if she's so set in her ways that it's impossible to give her hope that rather, well, there's a better environment now. People are more conscious of labeling people. So how do you suppose I may go about doing such, conveying this hope to such people?
Yeah, it's always a shame when there's any kind of prejudice or discrimination based on background, ethnic background. Of course, I come from the United States, where for centuries we had slavery of Africans. It was just a terrible thing. So we're still getting over that. All I can say is a good person will never allow anybody else to be defined by just one thing. Maybe it's ethnic background, or maybe it's gender, okay? A good person in good conscience will look to the positive things. There's a big fancy word, I'm going to use it, reductionism. Never be guilty of reducing somebody to one little aspect. And by the way, being a member of any national committee, Chinese and any national committee, that's no shame. Think about, though, prisoners, people who were committed crimes, were caught, were convicted. We shouldn't reduce them, even if they were criminals, shouldn't reduce them to what they did on the worst day of their life. We need to give people a second chance. So very real concern. I appreciate it a great deal. And all I can say is don't allow anybody to reduce you or anybody else or your grandmother to one aspect of their life. It's my advice. Yeah.
I see. Thank you, Father, for
Good,
answering.
thank you.
Uh, good good evening, I guess. Father, I'm Arting from 1AB Psychology. And first of all, I'd like to say I really enjoyed your discussion on hope. Like the idea of hope as a motivator, something that can fight against the negativity of this hellscape world. It's really uplifting. I feel like it's something we need, especially right now. But my question is, what's your take on when hope reaches the opposite end of the spectrum? Like when hope leads to inaction because someone is so hopeful that the world is going to get better anyways, that why should I personally take action to solve that?
Yeah, that's a good concern. And by the way, I love psychology students. So I teach at Fordham University, and our best two departments are theology, that's mine, and psychology. And they're the best students. So thank you. I hope you'll have a good career. All I can say is your question, I'm not going to really answer your question fully, but it invokes the old tension between the individual and society, the one person and the collectivity. And I guess an individual person can be hopeful, but I think it's even more valuable when a community, as your question suggests, projects hope, communicates hope. And by the way, that's why the church has a Jubilee year of hope. It's 1.4 billion Catholics around the world following a Pope. It was Francis that proclaimed Jubilee year of hope, making a collective statement that we stand on the side of hope. So I hope that every one of those Catholics and every other person of every religion and secular people too, that they will be hopeful people. But I'm especially impressed when we do it collectively as a group. That is even more powerful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Elijah Montalibano, also from ABSI, psychology. So my question right now is, I ended up having like a lot of questions over time, but like I think like a main one I sort of want to focus on that I think is pertinent to ask is that sort of like seeing, sort of perceiving that hope is sort of this living, sort of evolving, waxing and waning force. That like how have you like looking throughout like the history of not just like the South or the Philippines or just anywhere, like how would you have perceived, how do you think has not only like technology and like evolving material standards, like how has that sort of affected sort of hope as a force, sort of like how has, especially for example, the internet and social media, how has that affected hope as a force?
Good. And that's one of the topics that I was thinking of covering in my talk, but I couldn't cover everything. Some of you know the history of the starvation. I mostly know the West, Europe, North America. There was a time when we thought that the population was exceeding the food supply. There was a British he was actually an Anglican priest named Thomas Malthus, and he thought that we were doomed to starvation and that the limited amount of food supply would never be able to feed the increasing population. What didn't he figure out? He was wrong. That was the year 1800. It was called Essay on Population. He didn't figure out progress. Scientific progress, we call it the Green Revolution, right? People had new, better seeds, fertilizers, better planting techniques. So human ingenuity, science, saved us from a situation of starvation. Sadly, we still have starvation, but it's not for lack of food. The food exists. We just don't distribute it correctly. Poor people are blocked off. So that would have been the next topic. Thank you for that. I would have covered scientific progress. It's not an idol, but it does solve a lot of problems. So we're living in an AI age. Will it solve problems? I hope so. I have some doubts, but I hope so. Good. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Hello. Good evening, Father. I am Kyle Thaddeus Estamban. I'm a second year literature major.
Right.
And my question, I'll preface it with a quote. It's from one of my favorite books, The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. The quote goes, I've never aspired to be more than a dreamer. I paid no attention to those who spoke to me of living. I've always belonged to what isn't, where I am, and to what I could never be. So my question is, how do I go from someone who simply dreams to someone who has hope and has something tangible that they want to do?
Yeah, great. And literature, I'm glad that, Cal, you come from a literary background. Literature is full of dreamers, isn't it? Utopians. There's a whole literature of utopian. In fact, Thomas More, a British priest, invented his Lord Chancellor. He invented the word utopia, even though it comes from Greek roots. It means the pleasing place. It also means no place, right? So we're full. So think of Cervantes, Don Quixote, right? Another Spanish literature of the 16th century, I think. So literature is full of dreamers, and that is a great thing. It's what makes us human. I don't think any animals, I always think about this. Could a bird or a dog be a dreamer? They see the world as it is. If there's food, they go for the food. They don't dream of a better world with better food. They just take what they have. So that's what distinguishes humans, among other things, from the animals. How can we go from being a mere dreamer? I hate that phrase, but if you want to use that phrase, that was a good quote. How come my American students don't come in with such good quotes? I have to move to the Ateneo. That's it. The students here are better prepared. So yeah, it's just a question of taking the dream and making it a reality by actions. So you know the old thing, your head, your heart, and your hands, the 3 H's. Making it not just a abstract thing, but a concrete thing. Plant a seed, do something, investing in the future. That's the key to me.
Thank you, Father. Have a good night, po.
Okay, time check. It's 6:20. Probably we can have 2 more. Okay. Just to...
Are we going?
Oh, me.
So,
Okay.
and then
Hi, good evening, Father. I'd like to preface this by saying welcome to the Philippines. And you actually feature in one of our readings your living justice. And yeah, so my question goes, yeah, around the world, we've been seeing a wave of protests and movements for change. And these are obviously signs of progress, which is a good thing. However, like, at the same time, some of these movements have turned violent. More recently, for example, along with the trillion peso march in Mendiola, there's been a real outrage expressed, through, an outpouring of violence and things. So my main question is, how does the church and perhaps even you interpret, respond, or perhaps even reconcile the pursuit of justice and the use of violence in the pursuit thereof?
Yes, that's a very good question. And the short answer is the church has repeatedly, and again, I said starting in the 1800s, has repeatedly condemned the unjustifiable use of violence. Political violence, there's no excuse for it. If you want change, do a peaceful demonstration. But we all know that there's a couple of crazy people, some of them have guns, and that could spark what was a peaceful rally could become horribly violent. When church thinkers, starting with St. Augustine in the year 400 and St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1250s, when they started thinking about the conditions under which violence might be justifiable to defend innocent people, for example, in warfare, they came up with a long list of criteria that any act of force must measure up. And that's called the just war theory. If there's going to be a war, it has to meet these criteria in order to be justified. It has to be conducted under a legitimate ruler. It can't just be a vigilante. It has to be a last resort. It has to be proportionate, not out of proportion, and has to respect the non-combatants. Civilians must not be harmed in the crossfire. There's a longer list than that, but if you read Living Justice, you could have read some of my coverage of the criteria. That is a really good approach. Now, you might say we should be pacifists and say no violence, no coercion ever, but the Catholic tradition, the mainstream of the Catholic tradition, has continued to justify the use of force, again, for these particular conditions. You have to meet all the conditions, and it's always about defending innocent people from unjust aggressors. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Father.
Okay, just one more. Thanks. Go ahead.
My name is Talitha Chua. I'm a third year sociology major. So my question is, because of my major, I was gonna ask you about there have been many headlines lately, this new social phenomenon of younger generations suddenly being very, very proactive. Some might even call aggressive. Upheaval to, I guess, out old older older individuals, older institutions, simply because they want to, or at least because they appear to be so in a much younger demographic. It just seems like there's always that key term, Gen Z, millennials, and I'm pretty sure we all fit within that, demographic as well. So I wanted to ask, there's this kind of tension between the young and the old now. How do you see the Catholic community adapting or adopting to this, especially because we are expected since a very young age to become the new future or the future better than now?
Yeah.
How do you see the Catholic community going along with this?
Yeah, good. It's a very complex question. And, there's always been a succession of generations. Go back to the ancient world. Every generation said, look, I'm different from my parents. I want to distinguish myself. I want to stand apart. I reject those old traditions. And yet, for me, the answer, and for the church's answer, is always don't reject what is good in our tradition, right? Be open to new things without rejecting the old things. We have the phrase nova et veterum, the new and the old joined together. If I were a younger person, I would be very critical of my generation. I'm in the baby boom generation from way back, the Beatles. It's too far back. You don't even know about the Beatles. And to tell you the truth, I might blame my generation, the people in their 50s and 60s, for making the global climate change a problem, right? We're the ones who burned the fossil fuels, and now it's your generation that has to clean up the mess. So I'm sympathetic to that, but I also want to add, as a spokesperson of the church, in some ways, a theologian, don't leave behind, don't reject what is good in the tradition, the wisdom that we get from the ancient world, the medieval world, the modern world. Keep an eye on both. Be patient with your elders. I guess that's all I can really say.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much once again, Father Massaro, and thank you to our dear students. Before we bring this lovely evening to a close, would like to thank those people who made this lecture possible. The School of Humanities, spearheaded by the Office of the Dean and all the departments involved, all the staff in the Leong Hall, and of course, our students for joining and being with us this evening. So once again, thank you for coming and have a good night.